a seat in business class, a ticket paid for, a keynote speech at a prestigious medical conference in Geneva waiting. For Dr. Evelyn Reed, it was supposed to be the triumphant culmination of years of tireless work. But for the gate agent at Global Wings Air Flight 714, she was just a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed for a more valued customer. In a moment of casual, dismissive cruelty, her confirmed ticket was voided, her carefully chosen seat given away. They thought she was just another passenger they could push aside, another complaint to be filed and forgotten. They had no idea that in a few short hours, sealed within a metal tube hurtling through the stratosphere, she would be the only thing standing between life and death. The hum of John F. Kennedy International Airport was a familiar symphony to Dr. Evelyn Reed. It was a chaotic orchestra of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements, and 1,000 overlapping conversations in a dozen languages. For Evelyn, it was the sound of progress, the prelude to another step forward in a career she had built with formidable intellect and sheer, unyielding will. She clutched the handle of her carry-on, a sleek leather bag containing not only her essentials, but the thumb drive holding her presentation. Cardiomyocyte regeneration, the next frontier in ischemic heart disease. It was the kind of title that sounded dense and impenetrable to the layman, but in the world of cardiac medicine, it was revolutionary. To be invited as the keynote speaker at the World Cardiology Congress in Geneva was the highest honor of her 38 years. She smoothed down her tailored blazer, a deep charcoal gray that complemented her simple black trousers. She didn't travel in sweats or leggings. Her mother had always taught her that you present yourself for the position you want, not the one you have. And today she felt every inch the respected physician and researcher she was. She approached the Global Wings Air Gate, C-32, with a confident stride. The digital sign overhead glowed with the flight details. GW 714 to Geneva. Boarding in 20 minutes. Everything was perfectly on schedule. The line for priority boarding was short, and Evelyn took her place, pulling out her passport and boarding pass. Seat 4B, business class. A window seat, her preference for long-haul flights. It allowed her a small bubble of personal space to review her notes and mentally prepare. At the front of the line, a gate agent with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Brenda was typing furiously at her computer, her expression a mask of strained patience. A family with 2 small children was pleading with her about their seats being separated. Brenda offered no sympathy, just a series of curt, pre-programmed responses about the flight being fully booked. Evelyn felt a familiar pang of empathy for the flustered parents, but also a quiet confidence that her own journey would be smooth. Her ticket was booked months in advance, her status with the airline was respectable, and her paperwork was in perfect order. When her turn came, she smiled warmly. "Good morning." Brenda didn't look up. "Passport and boarding pass." Her voice was flat, tired. Evelyn slid them across the counter. Brenda scanned the boarding pass and the scanner emitted a sharp, discordant beep. Not the cheerful chime of acceptance, but a dull, interrogative tone of error. Brenda frowned, her eyes finally lifting from the screen to meet Evelyn's. There was a flicker of something in her gaze. Assessment, maybe annoyance. "There seems to be a problem with your seat assignment, Dr. Reed," Brenda said, her tone suddenly cooler. The doctor was pronounced with a hint of exaggerated emphasis, as if questioning the title itself. "A problem? I confirmed it this morning. Seat 4B, Evelyn replied, her own smile tightening slightly. "The flight is overbooked," Brenda stated, a line Evelyn had heard 1,000 times, but never directed at her in business class. "We had to make some seating adjustments due to an equipment change. Your seat assignment has been released." The word hung in the air, clinical and dismissive. Released, as if it were a wild animal set free, not a paid-for contract for service. Released? I don't understand. I have a confirmed ticket for that seat. "As I said, the flight is overbooked," Brenda repeated, her voice acquiring a patronizing slowness, as if speaking to a difficult child. "It happens. We can put you on the standby list for this flight, or we can book you on the next flight to Geneva, which is tomorrow morning at 10. Tomorrow morning. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Her speech was tomorrow afternoon, A 10 a.m. flight would mean she'd miss the entire opening day, miss her own keynote address. It would be a professional catastrophe. "That's not acceptable," Evelyn said, her voice firm but controlled. She knew losing her temper would get her nowhere. "I am the keynote speaker at a major medical conference. I absolutely have to be on this flight." Brenda's lips thinned into a bloodless line. It was a look Evelyn knew well, the look of a person in a small position of power who had decided she was not going to be helpful. It was the look that said, "Your problems are not my problems." "Ma'am, everyone on this flight has an important place to be," Brenda said, her gaze drifting pointedly over Evelyn's simple, elegant attire, lingering for a moment as if it failed to meet some unwritten standard for a business-class passenger. "Our Platinum Elite members have priority in these situations." Just then, a man in a blindingly expensive-looking suit strode up to the counter, bypassing the line entirely. He flashed a platinum-colored card at Brenda. "Richard Davenport, am I all set for 4B?" he asked, his voice booming with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. He smelled of expensive cologne and entitlement. Brenda's entire demeanor transformed. Her strained expression melted into a sycophantic smile. "Yes, Mr. Davenport, absolutely. We just finished getting it ready for you." "So sorry for the confusion." She printed out a new boarding pass and handed it to him with a flourish. Richard Davenport glanced at Evelyn, a brief dismissive look that took her in and wrote her off in a single second. He saw a black woman standing where she shouldn't be, arguing about something that was now his. He gave a small, smug smirk and sauntered down the jet bridge. The injustice was so blatant, so sharp, it stole Evelyn's breath. They hadn't just bumped her, they had a specific person they wanted to give her seat to. Her meticulously planned trip, her career-defining moment, was being sacrificed for the convenience of a Platinum Elite member. "You gave him my seat," Evelyn said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Mr. Davenport is one of our most valued customers," Brenda said, her defensive tone returning. "As per our policy, your policy is to cancel a confirmed, paid-for ticket of one passenger to accommodate another who showed up later? Is that the policy you'd be comfortable explaining to the Department of Transportation?" Evelyn countered, her knowledge of passenger rights sharp and ready. Brenda's face flushed a blotchy red. She was unaccustomed to being challenged with facts. "I don't write the policies, I just enforce them. Now, if you'll step aside, you're holding up the line. I can put you on standby, or you can call the customer service hotline." She gestured for the next passenger to step forward, effectively dismissing Evelyn. Humiliation and rage washed over her in a hot wave. She was Dr. Evelyn Reed, a leader in her field, a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every ounce of respect she had. And here, in the impersonal chaos of JFK, she had been rendered invisible, her status and urgency erased by the whim of a gate agent and the color of a frequent flyer card. She stepped aside, her body trembling slightly. She watched as the rest of the business-class passengers, a parade of men like Richard Davenport, filed past. She saw the mix of pity and discomfort in the eyes of a few other passengers who had witnessed the exchange. She took out her phone, her fingers fumbling as she tried to pull up the airline's customer service number. The line was, of course, busy. The final boarding call for Flight 714 echoed through the terminal. It sounded like a death knell for her conference. Defeated, she walked back to Brenda's desk. The line was gone. "Fine," Evelyn said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Put me on the standby list." Brenda tapped at her keyboard with a vindictive satisfaction. "There is one seat left on the aircraft, middle seat, last row of economy." She looked up, a small, triumphant glint in her eyes. "It's your only chance of making it to Geneva today. Do you want it?" A middle seat in the last row, next to the lavatories, for an 8-hour flight. It was the ultimate indignity, but her speech, her career, she had to be there. "Yes," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I'll take it." Brenda printed the new boarding pass and slid it across the counter without a word, her duty done. As Evelyn walked toward the jet bridge, a final defeated soldier heading into a battle she had already lost, she saw Brenda speaking to a man in a supervisor's uniform. He was nodding, looking over at Evelyn, and then back at Brenda with an approving expression. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and she was just another cog caught in its unforgiving gears. The jet bridge felt like the longest tunnel in the world. The plush carpeting of the business class entrance gave way to the narrow utilitarian passage leading to the main cabin. Each step Evelyn took felt heavy with a sense of injustice. The cheerful greetings from the flight attendants at the door sounded hollow, their smiles failing to reach their eyes as they directed the last-minute crush of passengers. "Welcome aboard," one of them chirped, glancing at her boarding pass. "All the way to the back, on your left, seat 38E. Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to form a reply. She began the slow, awkward shuffle down the single aisle of the economy cabin. She squeezed past people trying to stuff oversized bags into already full overhead bins, murmuring a constant stream of, "Excuse me," and "Pardon me." The air was thick with the scent of recycled air and cheap perfume. As she passed row 4, she couldn't help but look. There he was, Richard Davenport, already settled into her seat. 4B. He had a glass of champagne in his hand, bubbles fizzing merrily. His jacket was off, he'd kicked off his expensive loafers, and he was laughing at something on his tablet. He looked completely at ease, utterly oblivious to the professional chaos he had caused for the woman now shuffling past him toward the back of the plane. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. There was no recognition in his, no flicker of memory from the gate. Just a blank, indifferent stare that dismissed her as part of the scenery, another anonymous member of the herd heading to the cheap seats. He turned back to his screen, and she was forgotten. The irony was not lost on her. Here she was, a cardiac specialist whose research could one day save the lives of men exactly like him. Men who lived high-stress, high-cholesterol lives, and she was being treated as less than human, relegated to the worst seat on the plane so he could sip champagne in comfort. She continued her journey aft, the plane seeming to stretch on forever. The seats grew narrower, the legroom more constrained. Finally, she reached the last row. Row 38. It was wedged right against the wall of the rear galley and the lavatories. The constant scent of chemical toilet freshener was already pungent. Her seat, 38E, was the dreaded middle seat. To her right by the window, a young student was already asleep, his head pressed against the plastic, a textbook on astrophysics open on his lap. To her left, in the aisle seat, sat a large, broad-shouldered man who seemed to be overflowing the boundaries of his allotted space. His elbow rested firmly on their shared armrest, claiming it as his own territory. "Excuse me," Evelyn said. The man grunted, shifting his bulk just enough for her to squeeze past him into the confining space. She slid into the seat, her knees immediately pressing against the hard plastic of the seat back in front of her. There would be no opening her laptop to work, no reviewing her notes. She stowed her leather carry-on under the seat in front of her, the precious thumb drive inside feeling a million miles away from the lecture hall in Geneva. The cabin doors closed with a dull thud, sealing them all inside. The safety demonstration began on the overhead screens, the smiling faces of the video actors a grotesque mockery of her current mood. She felt trapped, not just physically in the cramped seat, but by the circumstances. She had followed all the rules, done everything right, and yet here she was. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, a wave of motion caught her eye. Two figures were standing in the galley just behind her, deep in conversation. It was Brenda, the gate agent, and the same supervisor she had seen her with earlier. It was unusual for a gate agent to come aboard after the doors were closed. Brenda was gesturing emphatically, her face a mask of anxiety. The supervisor, a portly man in his late 50s with a florid face and a Global Wings Air corporate pin on his lapel, was listening with a grim expression. Evelyn could only catch snippets of their conversation over the engine noise. "Absolutely sure the manifest is updated?" The supervisor, whose name tag read Mr. Harrison, was saying. "Yes, I processed the change myself," Brenda replied, her voice tight. "Davenport in 4B, Reed in 38E. It's all documented. I followed protocol." "Good," Harrison grunted. "Davenport is a friend of the CEO. We can't afford any mistakes on this one. Getting him that seat was a top priority. Just make sure all the paperwork is pristine. No loose ends." "Of course, Mr. Harrison." So it wasn't just about a platinum card. It was about cronyism at the highest levels. Richard Davenport wasn't just a valued customer, he was a friend of the CEO. Her seat hadn't been released because of an overbooking. It had been targeted, poached for someone with connections. The injustice burned even hotter, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. Brenda gave one last nervous glance around the cabin, her eyes sweeping past Evelyn without a hint of recognition, before she scurried off the plane just before the jet bridge disconnected. Mr. Harrison, however, remained. He walked up the aisle toward the front of the plane. He wasn't just a ground supervisor, he was apparently flying with them. He settled into an aisle seat in the premium economy section, just a few rows ahead of Evelyn, close enough for her to see the back of his balding head. The engines roared to life, pressing Evelyn back into her uncomfortable seat. The plane hurtled down the runway and lifted into the gray New York sky. As the city lights shrank below, Evelyn felt a profound sense of isolation. She was on the flight, yes, but she had been stripped of her dignity, her status, her comfort. She was just another passenger in 38E, a problem that had been solved and stowed away in the back. Fate, it seemed, had played a cruel trick on her. But as the plane climbed to its cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, fate was preparing another, far more dramatic twist, one that no one on board could ever have anticipated. The first few hours of the transatlantic flight passed in a blur of mundane discomfort. The drone of the engines was a constant, oppressive hum. The man in the aisle seat, a construction contractor named Gary, from his conversation with the flight attendant, had fallen asleep, his head lolling back and a series of sonorous snores erupting from him every few minutes. His arm remained a leaden weight on the armrest. Evelyn had given up the fight for it, resigning herself to huddling in her narrow column of space. Dinner service was a clumsy, logistical nightmare in the back row. The cart blocked the aisle, and the proximity to the lavatories meant a constant stream of people squeezing past. The meal itself was a lukewarm tray of something vaguely resembling chicken, with a side of overcooked vegetables and a rock-hard dinner roll. Evelyn picked at it, her appetite gone. She watched the flight attendants serve the front of the cabin first, imagining the real cutlery, the ceramic plates, and the edible food being enjoyed by Richard Davenport in seat 4B. She tried to close her eyes to sleep, but her mind was racing. She replayed the scene at the gate over and over, each time feeling a fresh surge of anger and helplessness. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the casual erasure of her identity. To Brenda, she wasn't Dr. Reed, keynote speaker. She was just a body to be moved, an obstacle to a more important person's comfort. This wasn't the first time she had encountered such microaggressions, such dismissive behavior, but the stakes this time made it feel infinitely more personal, more damaging. She abandoned the idea of sleep and reached for the in-flight magazine, flipping through glossy ads for luxury watches and tropical resorts that felt a world away from her reality in 38E. Her presentation, her brilliant revolutionary work on cardiomyocyte regeneration, felt like a distant dream. How could she possibly stand on a stage in Geneva and command the respect of her peers when she had just been so thoroughly disrespected? An hour or so later, the cabin lights were dimmed, encouraging passengers to sleep. The movie selection was mediocre. Evelyn put on a pair of airline-issued headphones and tried to lose herself in a mindless comedy, but the dialogue was drowned out by Gary's snoring and the periodic, jarring flush of the nearby toilet. She looked around the darkened cabin. Most passengers were asleep or watching their screens, their faces bathed in a pale, flickering blue light. It was a self-contained world, a temporary community of strangers suspended between continents, each lost in their own thoughts, their own destinations, their own lives. In premium economy, she could just make out the top of Mr. Harrison's head. He seemed to be awake, his reading light on, casting a small cone of yellow in the darkness. A junior flight attendant, a young man named Liam with a nervous energy, walked down the aisle collecting trash. He seemed harried, slightly overwhelmed by the demands of a full cabin. He offered Evelyn a perfunctory smile as he took her dinner tray. "Everything okay back here?" he asked, the question a rote part of his script. "As good as it can be," Evelyn replied with a tired sigh. He nodded, not really hearing her, and moved on. Later, the senior flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s named Claire, did a walkthrough. She moved with a calm, efficient grace that spoke of years of experience. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the cabin not just for service needs but for potential problems. When she passed Evelyn's row, their eyes met for a brief second. Claire offered a small, genuine smile of acknowledgement, a silent apology for the cramped conditions in the last row. It was a tiny gesture, but in Evelyn's state of mind, it felt like a lifeline of human decency. Evelyn decided to try and get some work done. She couldn't use her laptop, but she had a printed copy of her speech in her bag. She contorted her body to retrieve it, careful not to wake her sleeping neighbor. Holding the papers close to her face, she used the dim light from the galley to try and read through her opening remarks. An ischemic event, the catastrophic blockage of a coronary artery, has long been considered a point of no return for myocardial tissue. She read silently, the familiar words a small comfort. This was her world. This was where she was respected, where her knowledge mattered. Here, in this metal tube, she was just 30 She must have dozed off, her head falling forward onto her chest, the papers slipping from her hand. She was woken by a sudden change in the cabin's atmosphere. It wasn't turbulence. It was a subtle shift in the energy, a ripple of alarm that started somewhere in the front of the plane and was now flowing backward. People were murmuring. A few passengers were standing up, trying to see what was happening. Then came the sound that cut through the engine's drone like a razor, a choked, gasping cry, followed by a panicked shout. "Help! Somebody help him! He's not breathing!" Evelyn's head snapped up. Her exhaustion vanished, replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline. Every muscle in her body went on high alert. Her years of training in emergency rooms, the controlled chaos of code blues, all of it came rushing to the forefront of her mind. The call button chimes started to ring, a frantic, dissonant chorus. The junior flight attendant, Liam, was the first to react, rushing up the aisle with a look of sheer panic on his face. Then the calm, authoritative voice of Claire, the senior flight attendant, came over the PA system, cutting through the rising tide of passenger anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. The flight crew is handling a situation. Please keep the aisle clear." The message was meant to be reassuring, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the gravity of the situation. Another, more urgent announcement followed a moment later, a call that Evelyn had heard many times in her life, but never at 30,000 feet. "Is there a doctor on board? If there is a medical professional on this flight, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." The cabin fell silent, the only sound the incessant hum of the engines and the frantic, unanswered call for help hanging in the air. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment where her two worlds, the world where she was an anonymous, disrespected passenger, and the world where she was a life-saving physician, were about to collide. The plea for a doctor echoed through the cabin, a stark, desperate sound against the backdrop of controlled flight. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed, helpless glances. The request was repeated, this time with more urgency. "Paging any medical personnel. We have a medical emergency in the premium economy cabin. Please press your call button or come forward immediately." Evelyn remained frozen in her seat. A torrent of conflicting emotions crashed over her. The sting of her humiliation at the gate was still fresh. Why should she help? Why should she offer her expertise, the very thing that defined her professional identity, to an airline that had treated her with such contempt? They had dismissed her, devalued her. Let them handle it. Let their platinum elite passengers solve the problem. The thought was ugly, bitter, and it shamed her as soon as it formed. Her medical school oath, the promise she had made to preserve life wherever she found it, rose up to challenge her anger. It wasn't about the airline. It wasn't about Brenda or Richard Davenport or the injustice of her seat assignment. It was about the person who was choking, gasping, dying just a few rows ahead of her. Her conscience and her training were at war with her wounded pride. The war lasted only a few seconds. Her humanity won. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the snores of the man next to her. "I need to get out." Gary jolted awake, blinking in confusion. "Huh? What's going on?" "There's an emergency. I'm a doctor." she said, not waiting for him to fully process it. She squeezed past him, her movements swift and sure. As she stepped into the aisle, she saw the scene of the chaos. It was centered around the row where she'd last seen the supervisor, Mr. Harrison. He was slumped in his aisle seat, his face a terrifying shade of dusky purple. His body was convulsing, and a horrifying, stertorous sound came from his throat with each failed attempt to draw breath. His eyes were wide with terror. The young flight attendant, Liam, was hovering over him, his face pale, his hands fluttering uselessly. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me? Are you choking?" he asked, his voice cracking with panic. Another passenger was trying to pat Mr. Harrison on the back, a well-intentioned but completely ineffective gesture. Evelyn pushed her way forward. "Let me through. I'm a doctor." The passengers in the aisle parted, their faces a mixture of relief and morbid curiosity. When Liam saw her, his expression shifted from panic to skepticism. He looked her up and down, taking in her simple trousers and blazer, her position coming from the very back of the plane. He was expecting someone who looked like the doctors on television, probably an older white man from business class. "Are you a registered nurse? A paramedic?" he questioned, his tone dubious, blocking her path. "I am a board-certified cardiologist and emergency physician," Evelyn stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. She met his gaze with an intensity that made him flinch. "And if you don't let me get to that man in the next 5 seconds, he is going to die. Now move!" Her authority was absolute. Liam stumbled back, clearing the way. Just then, the senior flight attendant, Claire, arrived carrying the aircraft's primary medical kit. Her face was grim but professional. She saw Evelyn and her eyes widened in recognition from her earlier walkthrough. "You're a doctor?" Claire asked, her voice filled with desperate hope. "Yes, Dr. Evelyn Reed. What happened?" Evelyn was already kneeling beside Mr. Harrison, her fingers going immediately to his neck to feel for a carotid pulse. It was there, but it was thready and terrifyingly fast. His airway was almost completely obstructed. His lips were blue. Cyanosis. Severe hypoxia. He had seconds, not minutes. "I don't know," Claire said, her professional composure holding steady. "He was eating some cashews from the snack service, and then he just started gasping. We thought he was choking." Evelyn assessed the situation with lightning speed. The stridor, the rapid onset after eating, the purplish rash now blooming on his neck and face. This wasn't simple choking. This was anaphylaxis, a massive, catastrophic allergic reaction. His throat was swelling shut. "This isn't choking, it's anaphylaxis," Evelyn announced, her voice a sharp command center in the storm of panic. "The Heimlich maneuver won't work. We need to open his airway now. Does this kit have an epinephrine auto-injector? An EpiPen?" Claire and Liam looked at each other, their faces blank. "Epinephrine? I think so," Claire said, fumbling with the latches on the red medical box. She unzipped it, revealing compartments of neatly packed but woefully inadequate supplies. Bandages, aspirin, a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff. As Claire searched, Evelyn noticed the passenger in the window seat next to Mr. Harrison. He was frozen in his seat, his face ashen with horror as he watched his colleague die. And then Evelyn's blood ran cold. The man in the window seat, the man who had been sitting next to Mr. Harrison this whole time, was Richard Davenport's traveling companion. She remembered them boarding together, talking animatedly near the gate. And Harrison was the supervisor Brenda had been so desperate to please, the man who had ultimately signed off on giving her seat away. The cosmic, terrible irony of the situation was staggering. The man whose comfort had been prioritized over her profession was now dying, and she was his only hope. "Here!" Claire exclaimed, holding up a small pre-filled syringe of epinephrine. Not an auto-injector, but it would have to do. "Okay," Evelyn said, taking it. Her mind was a steel trap of medical knowledge. "I need to administer this into his outer thigh. Liam, I need you and another passenger to hold him steady. He's convulsing." Liam, galvanized by her direct command, snapped out of his panic. He grabbed Harrison's shoulders. Another male passenger from the row behind quickly moved to help, pinning Harrison's legs. "Claire, get the blood pressure cuff on his arm and find me that stethoscope. I need vitals the second this epinephrine hits his system." and I need you to get on the phone with the pilots. Tell them we have a critical case of anaphylactic shock. We need to divert to the nearest major airport with a level 1 trauma center. Immediately." Claire's eyes widened at the word divert, understanding the immense implication of that order, but she didn't question it. She saw the unwavering competence in Evelyn's eyes. She nodded, grabbed the cockpit phone, and began to relay the message. Evelyn pulled the cap off the syringe, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She located the vastus lateralis muscle in Harrison's thigh. "Holding him steady?" she yelled over the engine noise. "Yes!" Liam grunted, straining. With a practiced, firm motion, she plunged the needle deep into his muscle and depressed the plunger, sending the life-saving adrenaline surging into his system. Now they waited. The next 60 seconds would determine if Mr. Harrison would live or die, right here in the aisle of Global Wings Air Flight 7114, surrounded by strangers, at 30,000 feet above a dark and unforgiving ocean. The silence that followed the injection was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engines and Mr. Harrison's terrifying, wheezing gasps. Every eye in the surrounding seats was fixed on Evelyn, a stranger from the back of the plane who now held a man's life in her hands. Richard Davenport, who had been returning from the lavatory when the commotion began, stood frozen at the edge of the scene, his champagne-fueled smugness having evaporated into a pale, sickly fear. He watched dumbfounded as the woman he'd seen being dismissed at the gate commanded the entire cabin. Evelyn's focus was absolute. She pressed the stethoscope's diaphragm to Harrison's chest, listening intently. His heart was racing, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. His lungs were filled with the high-pitched whistle of severely constricted airways. The epinephrine needed time to work, to relax the smooth muscles in his lungs, to constrict his blood vessels and bring his blood pressure back from the brink of collapse. "What's his pressure?" she snapped at Claire, who was struggling with the manual cuff. I can't get a reading. It's too low," Claire stammered. "Keep trying," Evelyn commanded, her eyes never leaving her patient. She tilted Harrison's head back, trying to get a better angle for his airway. His face was still a deathly purple. The convulsions had subsided, but he was now terrifyingly limp. He wasn't getting enough oxygen to his brain. "It's not working fast enough," she muttered to herself. She scanned the medical kit again. "Is there a bag valve mask? An ambu bag? Anything to help me breathe for him?" Liam and Claire looked at her blankly. The standard airline kit wasn't equipped for advanced airway management. They were prepared for heart attacks and fainting spells. Not for this. "No," Claire said, her voice strained. "Just a simple CPR pocket mask." It was better than nothing. "Give it to me." Evelyn positioned the mask over Harrison's mouth and nose. "I'm going to start rescue breaths. We need to force air into his lungs." She sealed the mask and delivered 2 steady breaths, watching his chest. It barely moved. His throat was almost swollen completely shut. Panic began to rise in the cabin again. A woman in the row opposite them started to sob quietly. Richard Davenport took a stumbling step backward, his hand over his mouth. This was real. This wasn't a movie. A man was dying in front of them. Suddenly, Harrison's body gave a violent shudder. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips. His eyes, which had been rolling back in his head, flickered. "He's responding," Claire gasped. Evelyn saw it too. The stridor, the high-pitched wheeze, was lessening slightly. The angry red rash on his neck seemed marginally less inflamed. The epinephrine was starting to work. "His pressure is coming up," Claire announced, relief flooding her voice. "It's 80 over 50, but it's there." "Good, he's stabilizing," Evelyn said, though she knew they were far from out of the woods. He was still in critical condition. She continued the rescue breaths, and this time, she saw a small but definite rise in his chest. Oxygen was getting through. Just then, the captain's voice came over the PA, calm and authoritative, a stark contrast to the chaos in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a medical emergency on board, we will be diverting our flight. We are now turning toward Boston Logan International Airport. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 45 minutes. Cabin crew, please prepare the cabin for landing." "Boston?" They were turning back. The news sent a ripple of murmurs through the plane, but no one complained. They had all just witnessed a life being pulled back from the brink. With Harrison's immediate airway crisis slightly abated, Evelyn turned her attention to other vital signs. "I need a light," she said. Liam immediately handed her a small flashlight from the kit. She shined it in Harrison's eyes. His pupils were sluggish but reactive. A good sign. Brain function was still there. She continued to monitor him, calling out instructions to the crew. She had them elevate his legs to improve blood flow to his heart and brain. She had Claire administer oxygen through a mask from the plane's emergency supply. Under her confident direction, the chaotic scene transformed into a functioning, makeshift emergency room. Liam, no longer panicked, became her efficient assistant, handing her supplies before she even asked. Claire, a seasoned professional, acted as her liaison to the cockpit and a calming presence for the other passengers. Evelyn worked with a ferocious, tunnel-visioned intensity. She was no longer a slighted passenger in 38E. She was Dr. Reed, a physician in her element. She had forgotten her anger, her humiliation. All that mattered was the patient in front of her. After 20 minutes of painstaking work, Mr. Harrison's breathing had eased into a ragged but steady rhythm. The terrifying purple hue of his skin had receded to a pale, clammy gray. He was still unconscious, but he was alive. Evelyn sat back on her heels for the first time, the adrenaline beginning to subside, leaving a profound weariness in its wake. She looked at the faces around her. The passengers were staring at her with a mixture of awe and profound respect. The flight attendants looked at her as if she were a guardian angel. Her gaze then fell upon Richard Davenport. He was standing near the galley, leaning against a bulkhead, his face a mask of disbelief and what looked like shame. He met her eyes, and this time, he saw her. He saw not just a woman, but a formidable force of knowledge and skill who had just single-handedly saved a man's life, while the rest of them, him included, had stood by, useless. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling recognition of her power. In that moment, the dynamics of the entire flight had been irrevocably altered. The woman they had deemed unimportant, the woman they had cast aside, had just become the most important person on the plane. The 45 minutes it took to get to Boston felt like a lifetime. For Dr. Evelyn Reed, it was a period of intense, sustained vigilance. Mr. Harrison was stable, but precariously so. Anaphylaxis can have a biphasic reaction, a second wave of symptoms that can occur hours after the first, sometimes even more severe. She could not relax, not for a second. She had Claire and Liam help her move Mr. Harrison as gently as possible, laying him flat in the aisle with his feet elevated on a pile of blankets. The other passengers in the surrounding rows were moved to empty seats elsewhere, creating a sterile as possible perimeter around her patient. Evelyn knelt beside him, her hand constantly on his wrist, monitoring his pulse, her eyes tracking the rise and fall of his chest. "What was his baseline health?" she asked Claire. "Any known medical conditions?" "He's our regional VP of East Coast Operations," Claire replied, her voice hushed. "I know he had a heart scare a couple of years ago. I think he had a stent placed. He's supposed to avoid stress. A pre-existing cardiac condition. That complicated everything. Anaphylactic shock places immense strain on the heart. The massive drop in blood pressure and the body's adrenaline response could easily trigger a cardiac event." Evelyn's specialty was suddenly more relevant than she could have imagined. "We need to be prepared for cardiac arrest," she said grimly. "Where is the automated external defibrillator?" Liam produced the AED immediately. Evelyn knew that if Harrison's heart stopped, his chances of survival in the air were minuscule. But she had to be ready. She was the one-woman Code Blue team. As the plane began its descent, the fastened seatbelt sign chimed. Claire looked at Evelyn, a question in her eyes. "I'm staying with him," Evelyn said, her tone final. "Someone can buckle my belt over me if they have to, but I'm not leaving his side." Claire nodded in understanding and relayed the message to the captain. An exception would be made. The plane banked sharply, and through the window, Evelyn could see the distant lights of Boston on the horizon. The city represented a finish line, a transfer of care to a fully equipped medical team. They just had to get there. Richard Davenport approached her cautiously. He looked like a different man. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale, and his voice when he spoke was barely a whisper. Is he going to make it?" he asked, his eyes on his unconscious colleague. Evelyn didn't look up from her patient. "He has a chance, a much better chance than he did 30 minutes ago, thanks to the epinephrine and the pilots diverting the plane." "No," Davenport said, shaking his head. "Thanks to you. I saw what you did. I was at the gate. I saw what happened with your seat." The admission seemed to cost him a great deal. Evelyn finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, you did. That was Mr. Harrison's boss who called. A friend of mine. He insisted," Davenport stammered, trying to explain to justify. "I didn't realize. I am so sorry. What they did to you was wrong." The apology hung in the air, thick and inadequate. Evelyn simply gave a short, sharp nod. There was nothing else to say. The time for apologies was long past. The time for action had come and gone. The only thing that mattered now was keeping the man on the floor alive. The landing was smooth. The pilot, clearly experienced, brought the massive aircraft down on the runway at Logan Airport with barely a jolt. As they taxied toward the gate, Evelyn could see the flashing lights of an ambulance and a paramedic team waiting on the tarmac. A wave of profound relief washed over her. The cavalry had arrived. The moment the plane came to a stop and the cabin door was opened, a team of paramedics stormed in, their movements professional and urgent. "Who's in charge here?" the lead paramedic, a tall woman with a reassuringly calm demeanor, asked. Claire pointed directly to Evelyn. "She is, Dr. Reed. She saved his life." The lead paramedic knelt beside Evelyn. "Doctor, can you give me a report?" Evelyn, still on her knees, delivered a concise, perfect medical handover, the kind she had given thousands of times in emergency rooms. 58-year-old male, history of coronary artery disease, status post-stent. Witnessed ingestion of cashews followed by rapid onset of anaphylaxis approximately 1 hour ago. Presented with acute respiratory distress, cyanosis, and profound hypotension. Administered 1 dose of intramuscular epinephrine with positive effect. Airway remains patent but at risk. Vitals are now stable but tenuous. He needs a full workup and observation for a biphasic reaction. The paramedic was visibly impressed. "You did all this with just their onboard kit? That's incredible work, doctor." "Just doing my job," Evelyn replied, the words feeling truer than they had all day. The paramedic team efficiently transferred Mr. Harrison onto a stretcher, hooking him up to their monitors and IV lines. As they prepared to wheel him off the plane, his eyelids fluttered open. He was groggy, disoriented, but conscious. His eyes roamed around, confused, until they landed on Evelyn, the black woman in the simple blazer kneeling on the floor beside him. He frowned, a flicker of weak recognition in his gaze. He didn't know who she was, not yet, but his brain registered her as the focal point of his survival. As the paramedics carried him down the jet bridge, Evelyn finally allowed herself to stand. Her knees ached, her back was stiff, and she was emotionally and physically drained. The remaining passengers who had been held on board were now beginning to disembark. As they filed past, one by one, they looked at her. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered, "Thank you." A few simply stared in awe. The woman from 38E was now the hero of Flight 714. She gathered her belongings, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. Her presentation notes were scattered on the floor where they had fallen. She picked them up, the words about cardiomyocyte regeneration seeming both incredibly important and utterly trivial at the same time. She had missed her conference. She had missed her keynote speech, but she had saved a man's life. As she walked toward the front of the plane, Claire stopped her, her eyes filled with tears. "I have been flying for 22 years, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have never seen anything like that. You were amazing. You saved him. Global Wings Air owes you a debt it can never repay." Evelyn simply nodded, too exhausted to speak. As she stepped off the plane and into the sterile environment of the Boston terminal, she had no idea just how true those words were about to become. The reckoning was just beginning. The terminal at Logan was an island of surreal calm after the storm on the aircraft. While the other passengers from Flight 714 were herded toward customs or airline customer service desks, To deal with their disrupted travel, Evelyn was met at the jet bridge by a woman in a sharp navy suit. "Dr. Reed," the woman asked, her expression one of grave seriousness. "My name is Amelia Vance. I'm the director of airport operations for Global Wings Air here in Boston. Could you please come with me?" Evelyn, expecting to be shuffled along with everyone else, was taken aback. She nodded wearily and followed Ms. Vance away from the crowds and into a quiet, private lounge reserved for first-class passengers. The lounge was empty, save for two other men in suits who stood up nervously as she entered. One was the station manager. The other, she would soon learn, was a senior lawyer for the airline, scrambled from his home in the middle of the night. The story had traveled faster than the speed of light. The captain's report, detailing a life saved by a passenger who had been unjustly denied her confirmed seat, had sent shockwaves all the way up the corporate ladder. The name of the patient, a regional vice president, had amplified the alarm tenfold. This was not a minor customer service complaint. This was a potential corporate catastrophe. "Dr. Reed," Amelia Vance began, her voice carefully modulated, "on behalf of Global Wings Air, I want to offer our most profound and sincere apology. What happened to you at JFK was inexcusable. It is not our policy, it is not our standard, and it will be dealt with in the severest of terms." The lawyer stepped forward. "We understand the passenger you saved was Mr. Harrison, one of our own executives. The preliminary report from the paramedics credits your swift and expert action with saving his life. We are immeasurably grateful." They offered her a plush armchair, brought her a bottle of water, and treated her with a reverence that was a universe away from the dismissive contempt she'd received from Brenda at the gate. The whiplash was dizzying. Evelyn sat down, taking a slow sip of water. She was too tired for anger now. All she felt was a deep, bone-weary sadness. "Your gate agent, Brenda," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "She told me it was policy to prioritize platinum members in an oversold situation." Amelia Vance's face tightened. "What she did was a gross misinterpretation, a complete violation of our protocols. Overbooking policies are complex, but they are never meant to be weaponized to remove a confirmed ticketed passenger for the convenience of another, regardless of status. That is a fireable offense." "And it was done at the direction of Mr. Harrison, wasn't it?" Evelyn pressed, remembering the conversation she'd overheard. "To accommodate a friend of your CEO?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The room fell silent. Evelyn had laid the entire sordid mess bare. This wasn't one rogue employee. It was a symptom of a rotten corporate culture that valued connections over contracts, privilege over people. "An internal investigation is already underway, Dr. Reed," the lawyer said stiffly. "I can assure you, we will be taking immediate and decisive action." The karma was hitting hard and fast. Brenda, in her attempt to please her boss by enforcing a cruel and biased hierarchy, had now likely ended her own career and placed the very boss she sought to impress in mortal peril. Mr. Harrison, who had approved the unjust bumping, had his life saved by the very woman he had wronged. Richard Davenport, the beneficiary of the whole affair, had been forced to confront his own entitled uselessness in a moment of crisis. And the airline, whose system allowed this to happen, was now facing a public relations nightmare and an immense debt to the woman they had so casually mistreated. Their offers began to pour out. They had already booked her a suite at the finest hotel in Boston. A car was waiting for her downstairs. They would fly her to Geneva, or anywhere else in the world she wanted to go, first class, on any flight of her choosing, for the rest of her life. They offered to make a substantial donation to a charity or medical research fund of her choice. They offered hundreds of thousands of frequent flyer miles, monetary compensation for her missed conference that far exceeded the price of her original ticket. Evelyn listened to it all, her expression unchanged. The offers were lavish, but they were transactional. They were trying to buy her silence, to put a price on her humiliation and subsequent heroism. Finally, she held up a hand, and they fell silent. "I don't want your miles," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't want a lifetime of first-class flights. I don't want your money." She stood up, her posture regal despite her exhaustion. "Here is what I want. I want a written public apology from your CEO, not just to me, but to every passenger who has ever been treated as less than, for any reason. I want you to conduct a company-wide, top-to-bottom review and retraining on unconscious bias. I want you to change the policy that allows a confirmed passenger to be removed from a flight against their will for anything other than a safety or security reason. And I want the results of that investigation and those policy changes to be made public. She looked each of them in the eye. You didn't just wrong a passenger today, you wronged a doctor. And if I had been the kind of person your gate agent assumed I was, someone who would back down, someone who wouldn't make a fuss, your vice president would be dead. Your entire system is flawed. Fix it. Her words landed with the force of a final judgment. The airline executives were speechless. They had been prepared to write a check. They were not prepared for a demand for genuine, systemic change. Evelyn picked up her leather carry-on bag. I'll take the hotel room for tonight, she said. My flight to Geneva is missed. The conference will go on without me. You can send the details to my email. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the lounge, leaving the three of them standing in stunned silence. As she walked through the now quiet airport, she felt a sense of closure. She hadn't delivered her keynote speech on regenerating heart tissue, but she had performed a far more difficult procedure. She had exposed the diseased heart of a massive corporation and demanded nothing less than a complete transplant of its values. And that, she knew, could save more than just one life. Dr. Evelyn Reed's journey to Geneva was diverted, but her true destination that day was to deliver a lesson far more powerful than any medical lecture. It was a lesson in humility for an arrogant executive, a lesson in consequence for a biased employee, and a lesson in grace for an entire airline. Her story reminds us that a person's value is not determined by their seat number or their frequent flyer status, but by the content of their character and the skills they carry within. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly a life can hang in the balance, and how the hero we need might be the very person we just dismissed. The world is full of unseen heroes, and this time, one of them was in seat 38E. If this story of justice at 30,000 feet moved you and made you think, please honor Dr. Reed's courage by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more real-life stories of karma and consequence. What would you have done in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below.